Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom. Giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashim, Yahushai, Bashim, Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth. And salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to do a bit of an exhortation, in regards to certain brothers. We don't really, you may not have a woman, or you might deal with them casually here and there, but to understand also that the men in the ancient times, especially a lot of our forefathers, provided a lot more, spiritual substance, which was outside of a woman, and not to essentially attach our self-worth and attach our value, by the presence of essentially having their presence around us, right? We know that, if we boast in anything, we boast in Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, basically, right? And not to attach, our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-image in accordance and the presence by having a woman, right? Something I kind of wanted to thought about, and in regards to some of the comforting words that the Apostle Paul has shared, and kind of going in and realizing that there was a lot more to men in the ancient times, in terms of they added and had more spiritual substance to offer, right? And essentially, they were men of values. What the point I'm trying to get at, in terms of adding more and having more spiritual substance, outside of having a woman. And I kind of wanted to just hit, two quick examples, and I sincerely, hope and pray that this lesson, is edifying, right? Because sometimes, these thoughts might, cross your mind, and so on and so forth. And women they were designed to be a helpmeet unto the man, right? But we know that the brains of our women have been, strongly hijacked by the enemy. So, so this is just a comforting exhortation, and I sincerely, hopefully you brothers, find this edifying to you, right? So, this is I'm just gonna read this in this is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'll start at verse 6, but the point really is in 7. And it says here, "But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of the Most High, and one after this manner, and another after that." Let me actually get that word gift, to be honest with you. It might be charisma in the Greek. Let me just look it up real quick, right? Because Paul, he went into gifts and spiritual gifts in the later chapters, right? Let me just see real quick, 1 second. Let's see if it's the same word here. Okay, yes, it is the same word. So it says, let's see here.
Strong's G 5486, charisma.
Okay, so it says charisma, and it says a favor of which one receives without merit of on his own, right? It says a gift of divine grace, a gift of faith, knowledge, holiness, virtue, the economy of divine grace, which the pardon of sin and eternal salvation appointed to sinners, consideration of the merits of a Mashiach to lay hold of by faith. It says grace or gifts denoting extraordinary powers, distinguishing certain, well, it says Christians, but it's the Christians the Israelites were called Christians in Antioch, right? Just to clear that up. And it says enabling them to serve the church of the Most High, Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, the reception of which is due to the power of divine grace and operating on their souls by the Holy Spirit, right? So those different gifts that, Apostle Paul even touched on later on in the chapter. And I kind of wanted to, offer, some exhortation in regards to, what men actually, offered a lot more, right? Because it also touched on virtue, right? So this is one of the examples I wanted to hit, in terms of an example of virtue, character, because in this world it really teaches you a certain type of mentality of constantly pleasing yourself, right? It doesn't really teach you to consider another, right? um so it says here, this is John chapter 13. I'll start here at verse 10. And it says, Yahushua saith unto him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him. Therefore said he, Ye are not all clean. So after he had washed their feet, and taken his garments, and was set down again, said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? Excuse me. And it says, verse 13, Ye call me Master and Lord, and say, Well, for so I am. If then your Lord and Master have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash another's feet. I have given you an example, right? So going back to that point about virtue, right? So let me get that word. Let me get that word virtue real quick in the etymology. So here it says moral life and conduct, uprightness, right? So we were created to be, upright. The opposite of vice, a particular moral excellence. It says force, strength, vigor, moral strength, qualities, abilities. It says moral strength, high character, goodness, manliness, valor, bravery, courage, excellence, worth, man. It actually says man, right? So, just to show you there was more to men outside of actually having a woman, right? So going back here to the example, I'll read this again. This is verse 15, and it says, Yahushua speaking, For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done for you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither that he is greater than he that sent him. If ye know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. But I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, that he that eateth bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me. So Yahushua was giving the disciples here an example, especially Peter here, an example of how to actually, an example of virtue and character. Okay, when they become eventually when they would become apostles, this is how you ought to conduct yourself, right? So this is an example here of Yahushua giving the disciples, spiritual substance of how to actually be an example, to essentially, to believers, right? Because eventually they would have to go out and eventually they would have to perform and be able to, call our people back, right? Call those Israelites that fell away, right? Starting off with Cornelius, right? So the point really is here that men offered a lot more than just the carnal stuff. But the carnal stuff is very strongly spoken of in this time, because we live in a society that's extremely carnal. The person who rules is somebody who's very carnal, right? And a carnal man can't receive the things of the spirit, because you're always focusing on the physical things, right? So, and this is why I said, back to bringing it back home here to because when you might deal with like women, for example, and they strongly focus on the carnal, and there is very little conversation at all about character, about virtue, about morals, about scruples. Those sorts of things are basically not even discussed, or maybe even thrown out the window, because there's no they don't see essentially the spiritual benefit in regards to actually possessing and having these qualities. The scriptures say that add unto your virtue excellence, and to your virtue knowledge, right? To temperance, godliness, to roughly paraphrase. So the main point is here is this, that Yahushua was giving the disciple, Peter, an example of actually how to be in terms of character, in terms of uprightness, right? Because this is a part of a culture, we strongly lost that in terms of actually considering the welfare of our people. In the islands, they kind of they tend to do it, you know but there's a lot of wicked things our people also do down there down there as well, right? So not even just in the islands, but amongst the other tribes as well, right? But I'm just using that as an example, right? So um the next example I wanted to use here, where is it? Okay, so this is Tobit chapter 4, verse 1, and it says, "In that day Tobit remembered the money which he had committed to Gabriel in rages of Media, and said to himself, I have wished for death. Wherefore do I not call for my son Tobias, that may signify to him of the money before I die? And when he had called him, he said, My son, when I am dead, bury me, and despise not thy mother, but honor her all the days of thy life, and do that which shall please her, and grieve her not. Remember, my son, she saw many dangers for thee, and when thou wast in her womb, and when she is dead, her by me in one grave." And it says, "My son, be mindful." Here's the point. Here's really the point. I know this is essentially a conversation um, between our forefather Tobit and his son Tobias, right? Eventually, Tobias would have to go on a journey, to collect some money, and Tobit at this point, he's been blinded, right? He was out, burying the dead, and eventually, I think if I'm not mistaken, he leaned upon a wall, and then that's when bird had pooped in his eye, right? So here is some of that spiritual, as an example of that spiritual substance that Tobit is giving to his son Tobias, right? um so this is verse 5, and it says, "My son, be mindful of the Lord our power all thy days, and let not thy will be set to sin." And what is sin? Sin is transgression of the law. And it says, "Or to transgress his commandments. Do uprightly all thy life long, and follow not the ways of unrighteousness," right? So basically echoing a similar sentiment of what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, to the whole duty of man is to fear the Lord and keep his commandments, right? To roughly paraphrase, right? So it says here that verse 6, if thou deal truly, thy doings shall prosperously succeed to thee and to all them that live justly, and give alms of thy substance. And when thou givest alms, let not thy eye be envious, neither turn thy face from any poor, and the face of the Most High, Yahweh Bashmel Shai, shall not be turned away from thee. So understanding there's a spiritual benefit in regards to doing the right thing. But our people are very stupid when it comes to actually knowing the ways of the Lord. When it comes to those ways, like it says in Jeremiah, it says they are wise to do evil, but to do good they don't have any knowledge. They don't have any understanding of, like, what is the right thing to do here, right? But when it comes to doing the evil thing, they know how to dress it up, they know how to add to it, they know how to put some flavor to it, but to understand the ways of the Most High and to understand what's pleasing to our power, those things are seen as grievous. They're seen as a pain. They're seen as a burden. And which, in a sense, I don't want to say the word burden. I hate to say it, like, because there's a bit of a negative, mindset towards that. It's more of a guardrail. That's probably the best way for me to explain it, in terms of, you're driving a car and there's a sharp turn and there's a guardrail protecting you from protecting the car from going off and passing the barrier that goes off a cliff, right? So it's really protection, and that's really that protection is manifested within the laws, like dietary laws, for example, right? Don't eat certain things because this is what it leads to, right? So, and understand also why these things are strongly needed on the planet, right? So, and understand also the benefit of doing the right thing, because those things can come back to you, right? And that's something that is very strongly echoed within this book here, because you see the spiritual benefit of Tobit doing the right thing and how that came back to him, although he was chastised for a moment in time, right? So that's really the point here about men back then. They offered a lot more in terms of spiritual substance, spiritual gain, in terms of godly understanding, as opposed to in comparison to today, and in comparison to, like, that mindset of a man is just what makes a man is a man just sleeping with a bunch of women, and a man just essentially having a woman. That's not what makes a man, right? I'm kind of touching more on the physical, of what is described in this society in comparison into the ancient times, where it was a lot more that men had offered back then, right? The scriptures say to inquire and search the ways of your fathers, right? To understand that there was a lot more that they offered back then in comparison to, how we're seen, as today, rather than being seen as a walking ATM machine, right? So I'll finish this up here, and it says verse 7, and it says give alms. I'll read verse 7 again, and it says, I'll give alms of thy substance, and when thou givest alms, let not thy eye be envious, neither turn thy face from any poor, and the face of the Most High shall not be turned away from thee. If thou hast abundance, give alms accordingly. But if thou hast but a little, be not afraid to give according to that little. Well, here's the point as well, in regards to that spiritual substance, because they understood this, for thou layest up a good treasure for thyself in the day of necessity, right? So understanding, there can be a time when you might be in a situation and you need that. So when you were in a situation where you had substance, you dealt with it, and you had it essentially accordingly. You weren't essentially like a niggard, for example, right? And then because that's essentially in the same spirit we're doing at the same time, giving our substance, to our people, giving them, that bread, for them to actually satiate you, but because we want to be essentially remembered in those times of necessity and trouble, right? So Um, that's pretty much the point, I wanted to hit in regards to these examples and in regards to understanding that, there was a lot more to men offering more substance. They offered a lot more spiritual substance back then, as opposed to, how they're kind of dimmed down and seen in this society, right? But I'll leave the lesson there. But Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem El Shai, Bashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us His truth. Until next time, I say Shalom.